25 and a touch warmer with the sunny spells for Scotland and Northern Ireland too. More of a change as we go through tomorrow evening. More showers drifting up from France and over the Channel to southern parts of England, across the Midlands and into parts of Wales, and they'll continue to drift in during Friday. Somewhat hit and miss, so if you're after rain, this is no guarantee at this stage that you will see some. But increasing chance of seeing showers on Friday here, but also for Northern Ireland and Western Scotland. We'll start to see a weather front moving in, bringing more cloud and some showers possibly too. Temperature-wise, well, again, high teens mostly across the far north. We're looking at 21 to 25 elsewhere. These two weather systems then are merging together to form one area of low pressure that gets rid of the high and brings all of us some showery rain this weekend.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me.
And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Very good afternoon to you. Welcome to Brazier from 4 until 6. Coming up for you in the next hour, new reports claim Shamima Begum, who fled Britain and joined the Islamic State group, was smuggled into Syria by an intelligence agent for Canada. The ISIS bride is currently being held in a detention camp in northeast Syria after her UK citizenship was taken away in 2019. Her lawyers arguing she was a trafficking victim. Is she a victim? Should she be allowed back into the UK? Your view is most welcome. Also this hour, the Home Secretary has told police to get back to basics after a damning report found the public feel officers are distracted from solving crime by woke causes. We'll speak to the man who wrote that report for Policy Exchange. And Dr. David Starkey will join me to look back on the life of Princess Diana, Princess of Wales. It's the 25th anniversary of her death in Paris today. And with me for the next 2 hours, the journalist and author Ella Whelan. But first we have the latest news headlines with Simon.
Thanks, Colin. It's 1 minute past 4 o'clock. I'm Simon Pusey in the GB newsroom. Former Manchester United footballer Ryan Giggs faces a possible retrial after a jury failed to reach a verdict in his domestic violence case. The 48-year-old had denied physical assault and coercive behaviour against his ex-girlfriend, Kate Greville. After more than 20 hours of deliberations, the jury said verdicts couldn't be reached on any of the 3 counts against him. He's been released on bail until a hearing next week. In a break from royal tradition, the Queen will not return to London to meet the newly elected Prime Minister or Boris Johnson next week. Instead, Mr Johnson will travel to Balmoral in Aberdeenshire for their final meeting while he's in the post. Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak are now in the last days of campaigning. Tonight they go head-to-head for their final hustings. Well, Boris Johnson is warning the Kremlin is intent on undoing the good of Mikhail Gorbachev as he paid tribute to the former Soviet leader. US President Joe Biden is among a number of world leaders who have praised Mr Gorbachev's legacy following his death at the age of 91. He's widely recognized for his role in bringing an end to the Cold War. Today, Mr Johnson accused Vladimir Putin of attempting to recreate the Soviet Union.
Mikhail Gorbachev is one of those people who triggered a series of changes that perhaps he didn't anticipate. Maybe he paid his own political price for it. But when history is written, he will be, I think, one of the authors of fantastic change for the better in the world. And what I worry about today is that the current leadership in Moscow is intent on undoing the good that Mikhail Gorbachev did.
New figures show food is rising at its fastest rate since the financial crisis in 2008. The British Retail Consortium say the annual increase in fresh food prices jumped to 10.5%, up from 8% in July. And it's products like milk and margarine that are going up the highest. They say the war in Ukraine is continuing to put pressure on food prices. Royal Mail workers are striking again today in ongoing disputes over pay, with further industrial action planned. The Communication Workers Union says more than 100,000 members are involved, making it the biggest strike of the summer. The action follows a walkout last week in protest at a 2% pay rise, although the company says more money is on offer. Further strikes are planned for Thursday the 8th and Friday the 9th of September. Meanwhile, rail companies have also announced further strikes for the end of September. The TSSA union says staff at 9 train companies, as well as Network Rail, will walk out from midday on Monday, the 26th of September, for 24 hours. There have already been several days of industrial action over the summer as thousands of transport staff walked out over pay and conditions. The government has set plans to sell £1.5 billion worth of its offices as part of a new property project. The aim is to move public sector workers into fewer buildings over the next 3 years. Brexit Minister Jacob Rees-Mogg says Whitehall is cutting public costs so money can be returned to the taxpayer. The government also says it's aiming to save £500 million by using different energy sources. A team of inspectors from the UN's nuclear watchdog have arrived at the Russian-occupied town Zaporizhia. The International Atomic Energy Agency are going to inspect the town's nuclear plant for damage after weeks of shelling nearby raised fears of a radiation accident. The team say they are hoping to stabilise the situation.
With all clarity, my mission is a technical mission. It's a mission that seeks to prevent a nuclear accident and to preserve this important, the largest, the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe, in the whole of Europe, not only in Ukraine. So this is what we are concentrating on.
And NASA will make a second attempt at launching a rocket to the moon this weekend after the first takeoff was postponed earlier this week. The Artemis 1 flight has been due to launch from Florida's Kennedy Space Center on Monday, but was called off over technical issues. The flight is now set to blast off from Cape Canaveral on Saturday afternoon in a 6-week test flight around the moon and back. But with a 40% chance of favourable weather, the operation may yet again be clouded with issues. This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens now. It's back to Brazier.
It is 6 minutes past 4. Thanks for your company. Now, it's been claimed that the so-called ISIS bride, Shamima Begum, was smuggled into Syria by a Canadian spy. You'll remember she fled her East London home for Syria. She was 15 at the time, a 15-year-old schoolgirl, there to join ISIS. This was all more than 7 years ago now. She's persistently denied any involvement in terror activities. That's an account that's been widely challenged. But she's challenging, or people representing her, are challenging a government decision to remove her citizenship, something her lawyers say should be revoked after this, what they describe as trafficking reports. Canada and the UK government have both declined to comment because this is an intelligence matter and they don't comment on intelligence matters. The social policy analyst, Dr. Rakib Hassan, joins us now. Rakib, welcome to you. I mean, this is one of those stories. I know we get a big mailbag from the viewers and listeners about it, so it obviously does exercise a lot of minds when it comes to the fore. Does this latest twist change anything at all?
Well, I think that when it comes to Shamima Begum, I've always felt that there's this grand victim framing exercise where things such as her age is used as a defense for her joining Islamic State. And I do hear that her legal team will be fighting the government's decision to revoke her UK citizenship on the grounds that that they'll be suggesting that she is a victim of human trafficking. But much of this doesn't really change much for me, in that she did exercise a great deal of individual initiative when it comes to joining Islamic State. And before this grand PR exercise where we've seen Union flag cushions and Western style clothing, Shamima Begum participated in interviews where she didn't show much remorse. In fact, that she attempted to justify the atrocities committed by Islamic State, which we shouldn't forget is a genocidal terrorist organization. So I think all in all, when it comes to victim framing, I'm more concentrated on the various groups which have been persecuted and have faced rampant forms of violence at the hands of the ISIS barbarism.
People see in this, and I think I'm one of those people who see in this, a determination to play down Islamism as an ideology, as a coherent and for some people compelling ideology, as a belief system, a political value system. And any excuse will do to get people off the hook. They were too young, they were brainwashed, they were groomed, they were trafficked. And actually it just removes agency from people. Some people are persuaded by the power and the force of Islamism's argument, and we ought to take them seriously, in my view.
Absolutely, and I'd make the point that Islamic State was proscribed by the UK Home Office as a terrorist organisation back in June 2014. Many people who use Shamima Begum's age as a defence, she was 15 at the time when she embarked on that journey to join ISIS in foreign territory. I'd make this point that the age of criminal responsibility in England and Wales is actually 10 years of age. So she was comfortably above that. And I think that by using her age as a defence, I think it's very disrespectful towards British Muslim girls up and down the country who simply want to do the best they can for their family. They want to be contributory members of their society, and that they would reject extremist advances at the earliest opportunity. I actually think it's grossly disrespectful towards them if we want to use our age as a defence. And some individuals who do want to use Shamima Begum's age as a defence are the same people who would, for example, support the voting age being lowered to 16, which is only a smidgen higher than the age she was when she joined. And they may even suggest that we should take our environmental cues from Greta Thunberg, which they've been saying for years.
I've been saying for years, actually, when it comes to Shamima Begum, that, I mean, I don't give a toss about what happens to her. I mean, you know, she's made some bad choices and, in a sense, she's another country's problem now. However, in the real world, I've made the case, others have made the case, that actually she could become a poster girl for those who go into schools and talk to young people and say, look, this is the journey. You get brainwashed, you have a terrible time, you nearly die, you have years of hell, and then you have you realise the error of your ways and you come back into the fold. The problem with that analysis, and it seems quite attractive, is that you have to believe the sincerity of their conversion. And as you say, it feels staged, the Union Jack cushions, all the rest of it. It just feels like you're being played.
Absolutely. And I think the reality of the matter is I think much of the British public feel they've been played a great deal when it comes to Islamist terrorism. Colin, I'd make the point that we've had individuals who have, they've offered the view that they've been rehabilitated, that they have detached themselves from hardened ideologies. And once they've been released from prison, they've carried out further acts of Islamist terrorism. We have seen people who have been shortly that they've been released from prison shortly afterwards, committing violent acts of Islamist terrorism. Usman Khan, for example, comes to mind. Unbelievably, he killed 2 people in an act of Islamist terrorism at a prisoner rehabilitation conference. So I do feel that while some people may argue Shamima Begum could be used as this poster girl, this anti-Islamist poster girl, ultimately helping the UK government in certain communities in terms of reducing the appeal of Islamist extremism and talking about how terrible Islamic State is. I just think that there's not really a public appetite for that, and there's a fundamental trust deficit, you could say, when it comes to taking that kind or entertaining that kind of approach.
That is Dr. Rakib Hassan. Rakib, always good to talk to you. Thanks for your time. Appreciate it. Ella Whelan is alongside me today. If I can boil down Rakib's analysis there, don't be naive.
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, I think he makes the strongest point that he makes is this kind of framing of the defence of Shamima Begum keeping her citizenship or being returned to the UK is framed in this very difficult to get your head around terms, and the idea that she's a victim, the question of her age, but also just this idea that she's kind of been brainwashed and that there should be no accountability held for her decision to join, as Rakib points out, a genocidal death cult. And we know that that's, most people know that that's clearly not what happened, that she did make a choice, even if she was a young person. But maybe something that didn't get mentioned, which I think is an important part of it, which is why I think that she shouldn't have had her citizenship revoked, and I think she should be brought back to this country, is that there's a broader question of, sort of almost in the abstract, of how we value citizenship in the UK. And the way in which her citizenship was revoked, if you rewind your head back to that time when the Home Secretary almost kind of on a whim plucked it away, was, I think, probably pretty worrying for those of us who understand how important citizenship is. There are questions about how the British government have handled, for example, individuals who've gone to fight with Kurdish freedom fighters who have themselves been fighting ISIS.
Yeah, but 99% of the British population have no problem with that. 99% of the British population have a problem with somebody joining ISIS.
And I think the two things can exist in tandem, which is that you can have an extremely principled political and moral position against ISIS, which I think you're right, we don't express strongly enough. And I think there's a lot of cowardice around calling out the evils of Islamist terrorism and the problem that it poses domestically as well as in Syria. But I think also we shouldn't let that dent our defence of what citizenship means and allow the government to take powers that it shouldn't have in relation to dealing with citizenship. It's always these difficult cases that really test our belief in something, and Shamima Begum is an extremely difficult case.
Hard cases make bad law, so they say. Ella, thanks very much indeed. Now, police should be barred from taking the knee or wearing campaign badges on their uniforms because of the risk of appearing to have partisan political views. So says a new report from the Policy Exchange think tank, warning against police officers being distracted from solving crimes by woke causes. It cited polling that 4 in 10 voters thought the police were more concerned with being woke than solving crime. Let's turn to a former Met police officer and head of crime and justice at Policy Exchange, the think tank, David Spencer. David, welcome to you, and thanks for producing some really valuable and important, I think, timely work as well. If you could summarise your key findings, what are they?
Sure, thanks very much. Well, as you say, this report's been published by Policy Exchange today. I think the really important thing to say right off the bat here is that what we're not talking about is taking anything away from the individual police officers who work with real commitment and courage for the public. I think that's really, really important. What we're talking about in the report is the system that they need to operate and work in. And what we're saying in the report is that there are too many ways now where it appears that British policing has lost its way.
To what extent, David, does that reflect broader cultural trends? If you live, the police are merely a reflection of the society from which they are drawn. Explore that for us. That they're not out on some tangent. They are simply representing the values of the day.
I think that's very true, and it's an absolute bedrock of British policing, and has been for 200 years, that the public are the police and the police are the public. So I think you're absolutely right that what we see so often in policing is a reflection of the society that police officers work within. What we're saying is that as society gets more complicated and more complex, particularly around the threat from technology, is actually that we need to relook at how the system and how policing operates and make sure that it's fit for the future and to combat the threats that are coming in the future.
David, just quick fire stuff. Would you say it's not a particularly good idea for cops to take the knee, for cops to dance the Macarena on a Pride march, to drive around in cars emblazoned with Pride flags?
I think that all of this is pretty complex in some ways, and these are slightly different issues. Each of the things that you mention here are slightly different issues. If I take one of them, the policing of public events, and these large-scale public events, I'm thinking about Notting Hill Carnival, for example, at the weekend, hugely challenging, massive policing operations that are hugely challenging. And we cannot underestimate how difficult it is for police officers and police leaders on the ground to navigate. How do you keep people safe on the ground? How do you engage with the public in an effective way? How do you demonstrate impartiality? How do you make sure that with social media and iPhones videoing everything that's going on, how do you make sure that you maintain the wider public confidence in policing? And what we're saying is that's hugely challenging to ask police officers to do. And the current guidelines and guidance around it should be re-looked at to make sure that police officers on the ground are getting the support and the guidance they need to make the right decisions.
David, while we've got you, can I just explore a particular hobby horse of mine? Because I think it speaks to some of the problems that you're addressing. And it really struck me with force, I think, with the case of Shannon Matthews. Remember the Shannon Matthews case? And the Detective Chief Constable investigating that for West Yorkshire Police at the end of the trial came to the steps of Leeds Crown Court and described the perpetrator as truly evil and how he'd never seen anything like it in the course of his however many decades-long career. And I thought, there is the problem, that police officers now want to insert themselves into the melodrama of crime. Whereas they should be dispassionate, they shouldn't be ostentatiously emoting. There should be no discussion about how I feel, my experience. It's about the perpetrator, the victim, and justice.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the
you're familiar with the genre, David, aren't you?
The account. I remember the case. I don't remember the details that you're talking about. Certainly in terms of what you're saying and thinking about justice and impartiality and not necessarily over-emoting. I think that's true, but I think that's exactly what the vast majority of police officers are doing, and what they're focused on day in, day out is exactly what you're talking about, is catching criminals, protecting the public and bringing people to justice and putting them before the courts to do that. I think that's exactly what most police officers are and want to do.
David Spencer, fascinating report, and let's hope elements of it are picked up by policymakers. Thanks very much indeed. David Spencer from Policy Exchange there. Ella Whelan is alongside me here. Let's, to borrow David's phrase, straight off the bat, they do an incredibly tough job. They deal with stuff that most of us can't even dream of. On my point about wanting cops to be boring and grey, which is what I want police officers to be, I want them to stand above the emotional fray. Cat and hell's chance of that?
Well, I think you're right in saying that there has been a move towards this kind of, it's not narcissistic, but it's a kind of a sort of over-personalisation of...
In my 30 years of policing, I've never seen anything as horrific as... I don't care about your experience in 30 years of policing. I care about the victim and justice.
But it's also, I mean, you can also frame it in terms of the kind of the politicisation of the police, which might sound like a funny thing because obviously, you know, there are some of us who have interpreted the police as the armed wing of the state for ever since its inception, and that is inherently political. But the thing now with, you know, no, I don't think anyone minds someone genuinely bopping along to a song at Carnival. You know, like if it's a genuine, just kind of like whatever.
Really?
But
really?
no, but
it's puerile and infantilising.
I mean, like if you're just sort of like tapping your foot while doing your job. But the thing that happens is that you can feel that there is this kind of political agenda within the police where they are told to, for example, go along to pride marches and wear the colours, and you're very much sending a political message when you do that, and backed up by the fact that, for example, at one pride event recently, lesbians were arrested for making their political statement about gender ideology. There you have the police not only kind of dressed in the colour and the flags and doing all the rest of it, but directly involving themselves in a fraught political discussion, which is absolutely none of their business. And there lies the problem, which is that if you allow the police to become political in that way, then they're going to be biased and then they're going to pick sides, and it won't be always the side that you're on.
But they need political guidance as well, don't they? And I don't know what happened to the Chief Constable who took the knee, but if I was Home Secretary, I've got a pretty good idea what I'd do.
Yeah, I think there just has to be the police's remit, and we're doing a session at the Battle of Ideas Festival that's on in the 15th and 16th of October, asking, who are the police meant to serve anymore? What is their job meant to be? Is it meant to be doing the things that I couldn't and you couldn't do, which is running down the street after someone wielding a knife, and that's what we want them to do, and that they should be praised for? Or should they be standing outside of supermarkets with signs saying it's illegal to be offensive? We've completely over-bloated the framework of what the police are meant to do. And I think actually, probably to be fair to police officers, most of them would like to, there's a kind of a tendency for a lot of them to talk about burnout, for example, which is that they're expected to have one eye on Twitter, one eye on rape stats over here, and they can't do it all.
Yeah. No, there's a lot in that. Ella, thanks very much indeed. You're with Colin Brazier. This is GB News on TV, online and on digital radio. Coming up, we'll cross to today's Speaker's Corner. Ella's going to have her say on the strike action currently disrupting the UK. Within the last hour, we've had more strike action announced on the railways. She'll probably try and weave that in. First, let's have a look at the weather.
I'm Alex Deakin with your latest weather update from the Met Office. Another dry and bright day for most tomorrow with sunny spells and probably feeling, certainly by the afternoon, a little bit warmer than it does out there today. High pressure is controlling our weather currently. There are low pressure systems lurking. We are going to see a change by the weekend, but for most of us, as I said, that high pressure will continue to dominate. It's bringing a breeze in from the North Sea. It's a bit chilly on some of these North Sea coasts, and also just one or two showers drifting in on that breeze across parts of eastern England. But they're few and far between. Most places dry, staying with clear spells overnight as well. It will be a cool night once more, certainly across Scotland. Temperatures in rural areas well down into single figures. A little warmer than last night in the south. Some towns and cities staying in the teens. On to Thursday, and again, a dry and a bright day for most. A bit more cloud over northeast England especially. One or two showers are possible close by to Newcastle and Durham, but say most will stay dry. Late in the day, just the threat of some showers coming up across southernmost parts of England too. The sunshine will turn quite hazy here, but it will be a warm day, 24, 25, and a touch warmer with the sunny spells for Scotland and Northern Ireland too. More of a change as we go through tomorrow evening. More showers drifting up from France and over the Channel to southern parts of England, across the Midlands and into parts of Wales, and they'll continue to drift in during Friday. Somewhat hit and miss, so if you're after rain, this is no guarantee at this stage that you will see some, but increasing chance of seeing showers on Friday here, but also for Northern Ireland and Western Scotland. We'll start to see a weather front moving in, bringing more cloud and some showers possibly too. Temperature-wise, well, again, high teens mostly across the far north. We're looking at 21 to 25 elsewhere. These two weather systems then are merging together to form one area of low pressure that gets rid of the high and brings all of us some showery rain this weekend.
Tonight on GB News, at 6, it's Deebs & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Mark Stein. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club. Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hi, welcome back. Fresh calls, not for the first time, for Shamima Begum, yes, her, to be allowed back to the UK in view of the fact it's been claimed by BBC Podcast that Canadian intelligence were involved in getting her into Syria, where she joined, as you remember, Islamic State. Robert says, by email, in my opinion, she should never, ever be allowed back into the UK. She knew what she was doing. She was and still is an intelligent person. However, it went wrong, and she now wants to play the victim. Peter says it's taken her long enough to come up with this fairy tale of being smuggled into Syria by a spy. Mary says this country should be ashamed. Shamima Begum was a child that was exploited by traffickers and should be repatriated back to the UK immediately. And Barry says, I don't think Shamima was trafficked at all. I think it's old news from several years ago, and it's a ploy put out by her lawyers to gain sympathy for another attempt at letting her back into the UK. Well, it's time for today's visit to the Speaker's Corner. This is the part of the show where we let our studio guests get their views off their chest about a topic they are passionate about. Today it's the turn of journalist and author Ella Whelan. For the next 2 minutes or so, Ella, the show is yours.
Thank you, Colin. There is nothing dafter than a politician complaining that striking workers are playing with politics. Of course, any strike has, first and foremost, a practical goal, securing the demands of those who have downed tools. Over the summer, we've seen workers from the railways, communications, the post office, bin men, and lots of others form picket lines to demand various things, like pay increases that match inflation, at least, an end to threats of compulsory redundancies, or indeed better working conditions. But along with the immediacy of those practical goals, all strike action poses an inherently political question. Who holds the power? When bin men in Edinburgh went on strike after rejecting a pay increase that amounted to a pay cut, the smell of hot rubbish wafting into townhouses of Scotland's capital reminded its residents of what society would look, or indeed smell like, if workers weren't there. When RMT workers stopped trains and delayed journeys to challenge bosses who claimed that the coffers were empty, they weren't playing with politics. They were reminding their CEOs of their political power. Without us, your trains do not run. The spirit of pushback that has been in the air this summer has echoes of that exciting moment in 2016 when 17.4 million British people voted to take back control of politics through the Brexit vote. Remember that? Though it was 6 years ago and much maligned, the working class Brexit revolt has a legacy. It is this refusal to be told that there is no alternative, to give in to fate, to be cynical, that has been expressed itself in these summer strikes. Not just unionised ones either, it has to be said, but wildcat strikes, people walking out in factories in Manchester, tractors blocking roads in Aberdeenshire over fuel costs, and even individuals now suggesting they might club together to refuse to pay their energy bills. All of this is a rejection of the idea that citizens of this country are objects to be done to instead of subjects who make the decisions. In the face of the cost of living crisis, we're told pretty much to make do. Can't afford to heat your house? Why not wear a jumper to save the planet? Can't afford to feed your kids? Well, did you know that fasting is a healthy way to fight obesity? Can't afford to be able to make your wage packet meet your needs? Shut up and put up. Workers across the country are saying no more. If our lives are ever going to get better, we must harness this spirit of revolt and channel it into real political change.
When it comes to strikes, Ella, some striking workers are better off than others in the sense they can exercise more leverage than others. So, taking your example of the Edinburgh bin workers, it's quite a motivating force, the wafting smell of bin bags on a summer's day. But not everybody has that kind of clout. And so this is not a question of equality. Some striking workers will always have more leverage than others.
Indeed, and it could mean that lots of them don't have any leverage if we are to face the prospect of a Liz Truss Prime Minister, because we know that Liz Truss has promised, and I think she's probably got the backing of lots of the Conservative Party, to make it much more difficult for workers to have an impact. We've already had legislation brought in to say that agency workers will be brought in to undercut and scab on strikes. But I think there's, I think maybe you're touching at a sort of, not more interesting, but a sort of broader point, which lots of people say when I talk about strikes, which is, well, we're all having a difficult time. And, there's a suggestion that it's sort of almost selfish for strikers to be asking for more pay or workers to be kind of...
Where does the extra pay come from when it's public sector? We all want to be paid more, but where's it coming from?
Public sector and private sector obviously are slightly different, and it's easier to argue when it comes to the private sector because, and quite simply, I think the line has to be that workers shouldn't be made to flay themselves for the failure of bosses or indeed for the failure of the government. And, the question of where does the money come from is not to be put on the backs of someone who cannot meet their energy bills or indeed cannot meet their Tesco bill. Because there has to be a kind of a reminder, I think, to people, and this is what I was trying to get at in that little speech, of, there has been this conflation of we're all in it together, which we are not. And there is, the way in which work is organised under the current system in which we live means that there always has to be somebody at the bottom.
But it's a utopian vision. I mean, if you have a wage price spiral and that feeds into inflation, workers might gain, but pensioners will lose. They'll lose.
But I think the point is, and this is where I think political solidarity, and why I was trying to hammer the point that this is a political question. It's not just like striking to get a coffee machine or better safety equipment or something, that this is an inherently political question about who holds the power in society. And I think, however annoyed you get about the rail workers not, messing up your journey or things like that, there is a central point, and the reason why I brought in Brexit, because I wanted to say to people, remember that feeling where you were being told that you could change nothing. You were told that this was just life that you had to put up with. And so many people said, no, I reject that. And I think there's an element of that going on in these strikes.
Interesting. I disagree, but interesting point. Ella, thanks very much indeed. Coming up, David Starkey. Dr. David Starkey will join me to look back on the life of Diana, Princess of Wales, the 25th anniversary of her death in Paris today. News headlines first with Simon.
Hello, it's 4:34. I'm Simon Pusey in the GB newsroom. Former Manchester United footballer Ryan Giggs faces a possible retrial after a jury failed to reach a verdict in his domestic violence case. The 48-year-old had denied physical assault and coercive behaviour against his ex-girlfriend, Kate Greville. He's been released on bail until a hearing next week. For the first time in her reign, the Queen will stay in Scotland to appoint a new Prime Minister next week. Boris Johnson and his successor will travel to Balmoral instead of the traditional meeting at Buckingham Palace. The announcement comes in the last few days of the Tory leadership race, with Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak going head-to-head for the final hustings in London later tonight. New figures show food prices are rising at the fastest rate since the financial crisis in 2008. The British Retail Consortium says the annual increase in fresh food costs jumped to 10.5%, up from 8% in July, with milk and margarine among the products worst affected. Boris Johnson says the government has a plan to tackle the rising prices.
29 million households will get £400 in October. Every pensioner in the country will get £300 in November. Everybody who's entitled to disability benefit gets £150. But don't forget that when the handover comes, the next Prime Minister is unquestionably going to have another package to help.
The funeral of the Soviet Union's last leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, will take place on Saturday. That's according to Russian news agencies. The Kremlin is yet to decide whether it will be a state funeral. Many world leaders have praised Mr. Gorbachev's legacy following his death at the age of 91, including US President Joe Biden. TV, online and DAB Plus radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to Brazier.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Very warm welcome back. You're with Colin Brazier on GB News, on TV and on radio, online if that's your fancy. Many of you getting in touch with your thoughts on policing. This in the wake of a thought-provoking report from the Policy Exchange think tank today. Former police officer put it together. Are the police too woke? In summary, yes, and they're not concentrating enough on bread and butter policing. Paul says by email, chief inspectors and superintendents should be made to meet with the local public each month to answer local issues. They should not be allowed to miss any such meetings. This would make them more accountable. Paddy says the police making political demonstrations whilst in uniform is down to poor leadership and poor personal choice when representing the law. Everyone must be clearly seen to be impartial. Pauline says the police these days are not professional and therefore they lose the respect of the public. Let's just turn to Ella Whelan for her thoughts on this one. On the point about respect, I mean, I think it ties a little bit into my idea that we want them to be slightly grey. We don't want our police to be interesting, do we?
No, because if you are interesting or if you are involved in political or moral discussions, then you are taking a side. And that then becomes one of the key ways in which the police are having a negative effect on public life is the use and abuse of them in relation to things centred around free speech, about what we can say, particularly online. And so if they were more grey and more sort of agnostic about what was happening online, A, they'd have a lesser workload, and B, we'd be much more freer to have open and public debate.
Thanks, Ella. It's been 25 years since Britain woke up to the news that Diana, Princess of Wales, had died following a car crash in Paris. Her death sparked an outpouring of grief, really, from around the world. The Prime Minister at the time, Tony Blair, famously called her the People's Princess, adding that he and the rest of the country were distraught ahead of this anniversary. Prince Harry said he wanted the day to be filled with memories of his mother's work and love and for the way she went about those things. Our royal reporter Cameron Walker has been looking back at the night she died and went to meet the first medic on the scene of the crash. There is a warning, his report does contain flash photography from the beginning.
Stunning. Even after 25 years, to be here on the Tunnel de l'Alma and think about this tragic accident, every time I drive through the tunnel, I think about it and I feel a bit sad.
At approximately 20 past midnight on the 31st of August 1997, Princess Diana, Dodi Fayed and bodyguard Trevor Rees-Jones entered the black Mercedes, having left the back entrance of the Ritz Hotel. It was driven by Henry Paul, who was 3 times over the legal alcohol limit. Their car attempted to outrun paparazzi on motorbikes. Just a month before, a single photograph of the couple reportedly sold for hundreds of thousands of pounds. The Mercedes sped into the Tunnel de Alma, lost control and crashed into the 13th pillar. Off-duty doctor Frédéric Maillet came across the smoking wreckage seconds later.
In the back, 2 passengers. The man was with no reaction, no respiratory movement. Only one young lady. She was on her knees on the floor of the car, and she was almost unconscious with difficulty breathing.
After calling the emergency services, Dr. Maillet grabs the basic medical kit in his car and crawls into the wreckage next to the princess.
I sat down on the rear seat and I lift up her head and applied the respiratory bag to help her breathe.
Despite helping the most famous woman in the world, Frédéric didn't recognise Diana.
There were a lot of pictures taken. I realized that there were lots of flash inside the Mercedes. I didn't recognize her, as a only doctor in front of 4 severe victims. I had really other things to think about.
The princess was taken to Le Petit Sapatier Hospital for emergency surgery. Doctors fought for 2 hours to save her life, but she passed away.
I'm probably the last person that she heard. That was a big shock. I didn't think she would die so quickly.
A jury in the 2008 inquest found that Princess Diana and Dodi Fayed were unlawfully killed. A combination of a speeding driver under the influence of alcohol, the fact that neither of them were wearing seatbelts, and a pack of paparazzi pursuing them on motorbikes all played a part. 9 photographers were charged with manslaughter in France, but charges were later dropped. Tessie Ojo leads the Diana Award, a charity founded on Diana's belief that young people have the power to change the world. In the days following her death, crowds collectively mourned in public.
People grieved, not necessarily because they knew her or they had met her. People grieved because of her values. They grieved because of the way that her humanitarian qualities, the way that she made you feel visible, the way that she shone a spotlight on issues that were often hidden in society.
Diana's sons, Princes William and Harry, regularly support the charity that continues their mother's work. Her empathy and humanity radiates through the next generation of the royal family, helping to make the world a better place. Cameron Walker, GB News.
Professor Dr. David Starkey, the historian, will join me very shortly to talk about Diana, Princess of Wales, 24 years on from me seeing him being led away from Kensington Palace Gardens by the police for his own safety when he was doing a live interview and was perhaps less respectful about Diana, Princess of Wales than some of those who surrounded that live interview hoped he would be. Ella Whelan's alongside me, not with any personal reflections. You were 6 when Diana died, but it's being cast as this seminal moment in the life of the nation. I've always had some trouble with that. I thought Diana was broadly a good thing. I thought the reaction to her death was hysterical at times. It was the one and only time in my life when I didn't really recognise Britain. And I know many people think it was a good thing. I thought it was bizarre, and I thought there was a tyranny that gripped the nation for that week. And I think some people look back on it and feel ashamed, and they're probably right.
Well, fair play to you for saying that, Colin, because it's very difficult to criticise not Diana herself, the woman, the individual, but the kind of the Diana sort of performance which it became, because obviously it's how do you talk about something when somebody has died? It's very difficult. But Diana.
There were people. I don't think this is apocryphal, Ella, but somebody told me they'd listened to a phone-in radiophone in the days that followed. It went like this. Well, I was upset when my gran died, but nothing like this. These were people who had, they had nothing in common with this woman. I mean, again, I was a Diana fan. I criticised the reaction and the way it was stoked up by my tribe in particular. I remember interviewing Ian Hislop, the editor of Private Eye, and he said, it was you lot in the rolling news business. Look, people are laying flowers. Next day, more people are laying flowers. Next day, you better go along and lay some flowers because it's a thing, it's a phenomenon.
Yes, but I think that Diana was, for me anyway, Diana is very important, not because of the charity work she did, lots of people do charity work, whatever, but because of the way in which she marks the change in the royals in terms of the introduction of celebrity, of which she very much she embraced herself as being the, OK, Blair called her the People's Princess, but she was the one that went to the hospitals, that did the, public kind of crying, hugging the kids and all that kind of thing. Very much in the same way that you see your average LA A-list celebrity now doing the same, going off to some African nation and hugging a black kid. There's that kind of distasteful kind of celebrity element to it, which she harnessed very well and obviously ended up being part of her tragic end. But there, I think, that sort of the sucking of the politics out of the royal family, which I think was embedded in Diana, which was that you could know it's very hard to make a political argument I might make about democracy and the crown, and the makeup of British politics and the way in which it's run, because everybody kind of says, but look at Diana, she was a lovely person, she did lovely charity work. And ever since then, the defence of the royal family has not been the kind of old school one that maybe the Queen embodies, which is about constitutional stability or, the idea of the sublime and having a kind of monarch that is that represents something. But it's about, what do Harry and Meghan do, before they were ousted, do for charity? What do I can't even remember the other two. This is how uninterested in the royals I am.
For you, Ella.
Kate
for
and
you.
William.
It's our future Queen and head of state. By the way, OK, I'm going to stop you there because
it's the celebrity element.
I think generationally you missed it, and I think were you 10 years old, 15, 20 years older, you would have been as irate as I was. I mentioned Private Eye. Private Eye they took it off the newsstands in the week after Diana died because people objected to the front cover. Now, you'd have been in the trenches about that, going, what about free speech?
Absolutely.
Because what happened was that the country just had this collective, bits of the country had this collective nervous breakdown. And I think 25 years on, that's the moment you can, with some dignity, reflect on whether that was a good thing, whether it was damaging, whether it was helpful, whether it was potty. I happen to think it was. And worth reflecting, too, that even on the day of the funeral itself, which was, the nation stopped, half the country didn't switch on their tellies to watch it. OK, so I know there'll be people screaming at their telly saying, how dare you disrespect I'm not. She was a wonderful woman in many respects who did a lot of good for the royal family and for other great causes. I quibble with the reaction to her death, aided and abetted by the tabloid press, by Tony Blair as well, who demanded that our Queen come down and walk around amongst her subjects outside Buckingham Palace. It was a disgrace.
And I think it's very important to point out, you've alluded to the question of press freedom and, having Private Eye taken off the stands and things like that. I think it is really important to be able, not to bring Meghan Markle into this. I don't think Meghan Markle should be brought into everything. But I think there's a similar, the whole kind of way in which celebrity and the royal family gets enmeshed means that it's very difficult to make political arguments against these people, very serious, questions of press freedom to be able to talk about them, whether it's stuff related to Andrew, whether it's stuff related to Meghan Markle, there is still a question around the royal family about openness, which might be an obvious one. They're not the most open family in the world for obvious reasons. But there is the more that we focus on the celebrity of Diana or Markle or anyone, the less able we are to have frank, open conversations about what role these people play in the functioning of British society, of which Diana, as a member of the royal family at a certain point, did play a role and was part of that question that I want to ask about democracy and British politics. And so I think the reason why I said fair play to you is because I think even still after 25 years, there is this remaining kind of, maybe it's because I'm Irish, Colin, I've never been able to get over the kind of British devotion to the royal family. But I think in particular Diana encompassed that.
OK, Ella, thanks very much indeed. Well, let's turn to Dr. David Starkey, who can reflect on the death of Diana, Princess of Wales, 25 years on. David, welcome to you. I've just said some things about Diana, 25 years, and which some people will find objectionable. Actually, I make no particular criticism of her. I draw a distinction between her life, her death, and the public reaction and the media's handling of that reaction, in particular in the days following her death.
Yes. What did you say that people objected to? That I'm clear.
Talking to my ear. What did you say?
I said, what did you say that people objected to?
OK, well, I started by saying I remember well in Kensington Palace Gardens, you being led away by the police pretty much for your own safety.
Your memory is false. Your memory is false. That is a year after Diana's.
It was a year after. We were there for the first anniversary of Diana's death.
That is the first anniversary, correct. And by that point, we were already, in some ways, into a situation which anticipates where we are now. Diana really is the beginning of that mass emotionalization of British politics, and of course, to an extent, America. She was even bigger there. There became only one thing you could say publicly, which was that Diana was perfect, that Charles was wicked, that Diana was a saint upon a monument. Well, of course, she wasn't completely good, and Charles wasn't completely bad. What strikes me in retrospect, and I've been thinking about it a lot, knowing I was going to be doing this today, is just the sheer awful human muddle and mess of everybody's behaviour and motives today. What we know about the deliberate, if you like, pollution by particularly Mohammed al-Fayed, the deliberate starting of rumours to conceal the fact that the chauffeur that Diana had been given was drunk, conceal the fact the car was a hired vehicle that actually was a faulty one. Every single thing. And our mixture of motives too, as I said, our desire, or the desire of a significant part of the public, really to turn Diana into a saint. It was medieval. The piling up of every kind of object, from teddy bears to bunches of flowers to everything. It's like the death of an unexpected, violent death of a royal in the Middle Ages. Henry VI murdered, Richard II murdered. They become sort of impromptu saints, and you get these tidal waves of mass emotion, which of course are profoundly dangerous. We forget the fact that there were two motherless boys. We forget the fact that there was her husband, widowed in the most hideously public circumstances. We forget of the extraordinary doubleness of memory. The fact, I think, there had been, even though Charles uses that extraordinary phrase, whatever love means, there had been love. And at the same time, there'd been the bitterness, Diana's bitterness. Again, we've all been talking about the Bashir interview. Poor William has to pretend that Diana was trapped into saying those things. She wasn't. She wanted to say it. She wanted vengeance. She wanted to damage. She wanted to hurt. So alongside the good, alongside the AIDS, alongside the landmines, alongside that reaching out, there was that very human mixture of motive. And of course, it's the job of us, the historian, looking back, to try to recover that doubleness, that mixture, that confusion.
I was just saying to Ella Wheeler, my studio guest, David, that there was a kind of madness in the air that week, and it was stoked by, yes, the journalists, by politicians, by commentators, but from the public itself. And we got a kind of unwillingness to accept the version or some of the questions you raise. You know, Private Eye was taken off the newsstands for having an insufficiently respectful front cover. This is a satirical magazine. I'm mindful we've not got as much time as we'd like. I just want to skip this on if we can. If she was, what kind of person would Diana be now, were she still alive? It's an impossible question to answer, obviously, but I reflect on this, David. For that first anniversary that we talked about a moment ago, I went to Paris. Fayed's people got us into the flat just off the Champs-Élysées where they were heading. Dodi and Diana, they were heading there on the night of the crash. I'm not going to go into details, they're personal, but the flat was a Playboy flat. It was, I'll say no more than this, it was a little bit grubby, David. And I just wonder what kind of life she died in her prime. What kind of person would she be now? What would we be looking at now?
I am now going to commit the sin against the Holy Ghost. She would have been, wouldn't she, all-purpose Eurotrack. I mean, that was the fate if she'd gone ahead. I suspect her good taste, which finally she had, would have pulled her back. But if you look at the tawdriness of that circle round, and again, it's so painful, Colin, to say this. Whatever one may think of Al Fayed, he lost his son, right? You know, the person whose flat you're describing as grubby. And yet, there's an extraordinary piece by Tom Bauer, who knows more about this probably than anybody in the Times today, pointing out that Dodi already had a fiancée on the next yacht at Saint-Tropez, who was unceremoniously dumped to make way for Diana. So, in one sense, Diana was deliberately being entrapped in a man who hated the British establishment because Al Fayed, because it felt it had excluded him, saw, or thought he saw, that she could be a kind of bulldozer to force his way, not simply into British society, but, for heaven's sake, into the royal family, with a son who was the father-in-law of the heir, the ultimate heirs to the throne. So this, again, this extraordinary confusion of motive. But look at the punishment that that man had for his ambition. If Shakespeare were writing it, he couldn't have done better. The universal misery that's inflicted on everybody. It is, in some ways, it is tawdry. You use the right word, but in other ways, it is a genuine tragedy. Yeah. And I think by focusing simply on in many ways, the absurdities of the popular reaction, that wonderful phrase of the great historian Lord Macaulay that you and I have talked about before, nothing is ridiculous as the British public in one of its fits of morality. Well, that was a supreme fit that they were going through. It is ridiculous, but it has the most terrible consequences. And it wrapped what people up. Look at those two boys at the funeral. Look again, frankly, at a man for whom I have the highest respect, at Charles Earl Spencer. Look at the absurd speech that he gave. We, her blood family, shall shield. Forgetting, of course, the profound ambiguities of his own relationship with his sister. You see what I mean? Everybody, in a sense, behaved badly. Everybody was found out.
Including the public, including those members of the public who simply couldn't accept that it was a drink-driving accident. I remember interviewing Trevor Rees-Jones, former soldier who was the survivor, the only survivor in the crash. Why did he survive? Because he took the trouble to put his seatbelt on. They didn't in the back and they both died. The driver, off his head on drink and drugs, Henri Paul, he died as well. But the public simply couldn't accept such a mundane answer that it was a drink-driving accident. It had to be the white Fiat, it had to be Prince Philip, it had to be MI5 or MI6, it doesn't really matter. It was shady.
It had to be the paparazzi. It had, you see, again, the extraordinary thing, the British public depended on the paparazzi to know about this. How otherwise did we know about Diana on the yacht? But of course, the moment the crash happens, the wickedness of the paparazzi, the disgraceful behaviour of the press, which the British public have been lapping up in every single detail. You see what I mean? It is this, we're all caught out, we're all found out, but none of us wish to admit the fact.
David, I'm so sorry, we're out of time, but we thank you as ever for your reflections today. Dr. David Starkey there, joining us on the 25th anniversary of the death of Diana, Princess of Wales. It's gone 5 o'clock. Coming up live at 5 here on GB News, in a few moments we'll hear from the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace as he's joined by the new Australian Deputy Prime Minister. They're in Cumbria, where we build our nuclear submarine. We'll bring it to you live. Also this hour, the lawyers of the ISIS bride, Shamima Begum, who fled the UK to join Islamic State, calling on the UK to reinstate her citizenship after claims she was trafficked. There's reports suggesting when she left the UK at 15, she was smuggled into Syria by a spy. We'll speak to a former newspaper editor and media consultant, Neil Wallace, about whether there is a case for her return to the UK. Also, a crackdown on woke policing. The call from the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, after a damning report, they're always damning, aren't they, those reports, found the public feel officers are distracted from solving crime. Has British policing lost its way? And one final sign-off for the outgoing Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, set to approve the it says £30 million funding. I think it might be, what do you think, Ella, 30 billion?
I think it'd probably be quite cheap.
Yeah, it'd be a cheap nuclear, yeah, we'll find out. Britain's newest power station anyway, nuclear power station. With me for the next hour, the journalist and author Ella Whelan. There she is. But first, the latest news headlines. Here's Simon.
Thanks, Colin. I'm Simon Pusey in the GB newsroom. Former Manchester United footballer Ryan Giggs faces a possible retrial after a jury failed to reach a verdict in his domestic violence case. The 48-year-old had denied physical assault and coercive behaviour against his ex-girlfriend, Kate Greville, after more than 20 hours of deliberations. The jury said verdicts couldn't be reached on any of the 3 counts against him. He's been released on bail until a hearing next week. For the first time in her reign, the Queen will stay in Scotland to appoint a new Prime Minister next week. Boris Johnson and his successor will travel to Balmoral instead of the traditional meeting at Buckingham Palace. The announcement comes in the last few days of the Tory leadership race, with Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak going head-to-head for the final hustings in London tonight. The funeral of the Soviet Union's last leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, will take place on Saturday. That's according to Russian news agencies. The Kremlin is yet to decide whether it will be a state funeral. Many world leaders praised Mr. Gorbachev's legacy following his death at the age of 91, including US President Joe Biden. New figures show food is rising at its fastest rate since the financial crisis in 2008. The British Retail Consortium say the annual increase in fresh food prices jumped to 10.5%, up from 8% in July. And it's products like milk and margarine that are going up the highest. They say the war in Ukraine is continuing to put pressure on food prices. Boris Johnson says the government has plans in place to tackle the rising prices.
29 million households will get £400 in October. Every pensioner in the country will get £300 in November. Everybody who's entitled to disability benefit gets £150. But don't forget that when the handover comes, the next Prime Minister is unquestionably going to have another package to help. We're now delivering 26% more gas already from the North Sea. We're going to go ahead with very, very rapidly with new wind farm projects and new nuclear projects, so that the medium long-term future is really very bright indeed.
Royal Mail workers are striking again today in ongoing disputes over pay, with further industrial action planned. The Communication Workers Union says more than 100,000 members are involved, making it the biggest strike of the summer. The action follows a walkout last week in protest at a 2% pay rise, although the company says more money is on offer. Further strikes are planned for Thursday the 8th and Friday the 9th of September. The government has set plans to sell £1.5 billion worth of its offices as part of a new property strategy. The aim is to move public sector workers into fewer buildings over the next 3 years. Brexit Minister Jacob Rees-Mogg says Whitehall is cutting public costs so money can be returned to the taxpayer. The government also says it's aiming to save £500 million by using different energy sources. A team of inspectors from the UN's nuclear watchdog have arrived at the Russian-occupied town Zaporizhia. The International Atomic Energy Agency are to inspect the town's nuclear plant for damage after weeks of shelling nearby raised fears of a radiation accident. The team say they are hoping to stabilise the situation.
With all clarity, my mission is a technical mission. It's a mission that seeks to prevent a nuclear accident and to preserve this important, the largest, the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe, in the whole of Europe, not only in Ukraine. So this is what we are concentrating on.
And NASA will attempt to make a second launch of the rocket to the moon this weekend after the first takeoff was postponed earlier this week. The Artemis 1 flight had been due to launch from Florida's Kennedy Space Center on Monday, but was called off over technical issues. The flight is now set to blast off from Cape Canaveral on Saturday afternoon in a 6-week test flight around the moon and back. But with a 40% chance of favourable weather, the operation may yet again be clouded with issues. This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens now. It's back to Brazier.
6 minutes past 5. Thanks for your company. Now, it's been claimed that the so-called ISIS bride, Shamima Begum, was smuggled into Syria by a Canadian spy. You'll remember that she left her East London home for Syria. She was 15 at the time, a schoolgirl, to join ISIS. It was all more than 7 years ago, this. She's persistently denied any involvement in terror activities and is challenging a government decision to remove her citizenship, something her lawyers say should be revoked after the latest report suggesting she was effectively trafficked there. Canada and the UK government have both declined to comment. It's an intelligence matter. The former newspaper editor and media consultant Neil Wallace joins us now. Hi to you, Neil. I was talking to Rakib Hassan an hour ago, who said this is just the latest instalment in an attempt, a pretty plainly false attempt, to rehabilitate somebody whose actions were simply beyond the pale.
I don't think I disagree with that. I quite accept that she was very young. But what was more to the point, I think, very young when she went there. But more to the point, I think, is how she reacted when she was found in a camp there by the Times reporters, and how she spoke then, and her lack of remorse, her belief that there was nothing to be ashamed of, that she her unwillingness to turn against ISIS, I think is the thing that mattered. She was plainly a willing member of ISIS. Do we want someone like that back in this country? I don't think we do.
She's 15. It's a question I've pondered on myself, because I take the view, maybe you do too, Neil, certainly many of our viewers do, that there seems to be an attempt, when it comes to Islamist terror, to try and discount the actions of perpetrators, to displace their motives. They were groomed, they were brainwashed, they were mentally ill. They weren't really persuaded by a coherent set of arguments that they found compelling. Oh yes, very often they were, and that's something that's happened for centuries, eons. Young, angry young men, sometimes angry young women, motivated to change the world by a set of ideas. I think that's all true, but it's also true she was only 15.
I think you're right, Colin, but I think the first part of your argument, I think, really comes to it. This wasn't a spur of the moment thing. This was a decision by her and two of her friends. They planned this extremely cleverly. They weren't a couple of three naive kids. I so wish they hadn't been brainwashed as they were, and many people get brainwashed. But then you have to take the responsibility for your actions. And I'm afraid she was 15 going on 25. And they knew the horrors that they were going to, because it was all over the media. It was all around them in their world. They got excited by it. They found it glamorous. They found it something they wanted to be part of. And then they were party to it for a long time. And there was no feeling whatsoever. When the Times and other media got to her, found her some years later, of remorse. She had plenty of time to, if you like, find what you might call buyer's remorse. She lived with these people. She saw what they did. She went out of her way to say, no, she wasn't shocked by seeing beheaded bodies. This is not someone who realized they'd made some terrible, tragic mistake. What happened with her is that she now finds herself in a situation she doesn't like. As a result of her actions, she has lost 3 children. And I don't see what is to the betterment of Britain to bring this woman home. And we're talking about a woman now.
Yeah. Neil, I've got a feeling this is a story, it's got a circular quality story. It will keep coming back for years to come. And a story, a completely unrelated story, and I'm keen to talk to you about it because, as a former tabloid newspaper editor. And it's a story that will only come the once, in a sense, 25th anniversary today of the death of Diana, Princess of Wales. Just summarise your thoughts on this day as a former newspaper editor.
I remember this day 25 years ago so vividly. I was asleep. It was 2 a.m. in the morning. The phone rang. I was deputy editor of The Sun at the time. It was the editor of The Sun in tears, telling me what had happened. And he could barely speak because of his tears. And I was barely capable. I was so shocked of telling my wife, who was next to me, what had happened. And we, all of us, basically got up, got dressed, and we were in the office in the early hours, and we didn't come home until 24 hours later. It was arguably the most shocking, or one of the most shocking times of my entire life in the media. It was the most shocking, actually. I was comparing it in my head then to the Gulf Wars and things like that, and to the Falklands. But no, in fact, in truth, it was more shocking because the outwelling of pain and anger in the country was truly astonishing. And at one stage, I remember, I think it was us, and then I think the Daily Mail followed us when we said, why is the flag over Buckingham Palace not flying over half-mast? Why are the royals not reacting to this tragedy? Because at the time they were in Balmoral, and there was this terribly misjudged silence coming out of them, almost as though it's got nothing to do with us.
But Neil, I mean, you'll know there'll be people listening to that saying, well, hang on, a grandmother had just lost somebody who admittedly was a complicated figure, but the Queen was grieving. The Prince of Wales had lost his ex-wife, and two boys had lost their mother, and they were doing it in the controlled environment of Balmoral. And how on earth can it be right for tabloid editors, not just tabloid editors, newspaper editors and commentators in London to stamp their feet, and Alistair Campbell to demand that our head of state travel south?
Well, I can see that argument completely about the boys, about William and Harry at that time. But this is the monarch and the monarch-to-be. This was a time of enormous national pain. And this was a very difficult, dangerous time for the monarchy, because the anger at the lack of the response of the senior royals was palpable. And in fact, I remember the owner of The Sun, Mr. Murdoch, calling and talking to his editors to say, be very careful you do not whip up this sense of anger against the senior royal, even though we were reflecting the calls and the visits and the letters that we were getting to our office, that our reporters were seeing on the street.
Yeah.
There was genuine
Neil, just in a word, I know we're almost out of time, but did it go over the top? I mean, when you ended up with, I think it was W.H. Smith's who took Private Eye off the stands because the front cover was deemed to be insufficiently respectful. Did it just, there was a whiff of hysteria in the air, was there not?
I don't think that it went over the top because it was so awful. I'm sure you, like me, went to see the carpet of flowers outside her house. It was the most stunning thing. And there was almost a national exhalation of breath as the royals finally turned up and visited. there was a huge sense of relief that at last they had done the right thing, and they were chiming in with how the British nation felt.
Yeah.
Be
Neil,
no doubt about it, Colin. It was enormous.
We've got to leave it there, but I'm glad we talked about it. It's the 25th anniversary today of the death of Diana, Princess of Wales. Much covered, seminal moment, was it or not? Let us know your thoughts at GB News. Neil Wallace there. Police should be barred from taking the knee or wearing campaign badges on their uniforms because of the risk of appearing to have partisan political views. So says a new report from the Policy Exchange think tank, warning against police being distracted from solving crimes by PC causes, woke causes. It cited polling that 4 in 10 voters thought the police were more concerned with being woke than solving crimes. Donna Jones is Hampshire's Police and Crime Commissioner for the Conservative Party. Donna Jones, welcome to you. You've been outspoken about this. I guess there's a lot in this report you would agree with.
Yeah, I mean, I think David Spencer's report is fairly common sense, let's be honest. There's a lot of the things that are already in train now. He talks in the report, there are 10 or 12 recommendations. He talks about, for example, policing needing to get tougher on protesters, particularly those stop oil protests, people gluing themselves to motorways, the M25, for example. Well, the government have brought in new legislation to give the police the power they need. He talks about reforms of the College of Policing. He talks about, criminalised police officers, those that break the law themselves, being, sacked quicker. Lots of these things are really, really common sense. And actually, from my position as a police and crime commissioner, there are many things in that report that are within the gift for me to do. For example, he talks about bringing in an app to make Britain be able to report crime a lot better. Well, when I got elected as police and crime commissioner, representing 2 million people this time last year, on May 21, it's one of the first things I set about doing, and that's a project I've got in train. And one of my colleagues, Steve Turner, up in Cleveland, has already done that with an app to report crime. So lots of common sense in there. But clearly what this is really talking about is about getting back to basics.
Yeah.
It's about police really prioritising on those high harm crimes, on the crimes that people really feel aggrieved about when they're victims of it. And yes, I don't think there's anything in that report that any of us really could disagree with.
How easy will it be to put the genie back in the bottle if you've got a cohort, a generation of police officers who think that if they're sent to police and steward a pride march, that they think it's OK to start holding leashes of people dressed as dogs in gimp masks or dance the Macarena? If you've got a generation of police officers who think that's what policing entails, how do you then seek to persuade them to be boring and grey and dull?
Well, I think this is a reflection of the fact that there are many in LGBT communities across the country who still feel disconnected from the police, who feel that, things that have happened in the past that perhaps
Donna,
were...
as you know, there are lots of communities who feel that, they're disconnected from crimes being solved.
Well, absolutely quite right, Colin. I agree with that. And I think that's why police chiefs across the country have made it a priority to reach out to some of the, communities in our society that have protected characteristics. Now, what I would say as a police and crime commissioner is that if a chief constable is sending police officers to a pride event because there's going to be 2 or 3 or 5,000 people there, and they're sending them there as public order police officers to keep crowd safety and everything else, fine. If they're sending them there because they want to connect with the LGBT community, let's make sure that we are going to all the burglaries, all of the serious violence, all of the stabbings first, because that's core business. And then if you've got enough police officers, which, by the way, no force has got enough police officers, we know that, then you start to do that extra sort of cherry on the cake stuff. Now, for me, the report is stating what a number of us have been talking about for a number of months. And actually, I think this is really key. Police officers who get recruited want to join the police force because actually they want to catch bad people. They want to make our community safer. And actually, there is a real will. And I want to stick up for policing a little bit here. The police officers that I know and work with really do want to catch the baddies, get them in prison, get them charged and do what they need to do. So a real wake-up call here, perhaps for the chiefs, for the National Police Chiefs Council to give consideration to, and also for some of the police commissioners across the country that might just need to be repositioning their priorities for their chiefs to make sure that they are delivering a police service that the public are paying their taxes for, that delivers what they need. And as far as I'm concerned, burglaries are an absolute must. We must be responding to 100% of domestic burglaries, full stop, unequivocally. That must happen.
Donna Jones is Hampshire's Police and Crime Commissioner. Donna Jones, appreciate your time. Thanks very much indeed. Ella Whelan is alongside me. Donna might also have mentioned, I think, the idea of policing by consent. I mean, she's not saying that actually the police officers shouldn't be dancing the Macarena at a gay pride event. I think they shouldn't be, because I think that, yes, she says it helps curry favour with certain communities, but lots of people see images like that and think, these are not cops acting on my behalf. This is frivolous and childish and puerile, and it's not the police force I expect to be paying for. And then you undermine the principle of policing by consent.
There's just this warped idea that the police are your best friends, and that has had some really damaging consequences. For example, just to take a small area, I remember when I used to work in a secondary school many years ago, the idea of having a police officer present and sort of involved in the kids' lives was sort of like all the rage, and there was no something that horrified me. There was no suggestion that actually, discussion with a police officer would be something very serious that you would, that particularly for kids. And we know that in relation to, this situation with child Q, who was strip searched recently, there has been this kind of blurred lines as to what role a police officer is meant to play. Now, having a police officer in a community who is known to that community, who's a Bobby on the beat, to use that phrase, who is, understands the tensions and the priorities of that particular area, is able to respond to things. If a crime happens, thinks, well, I probably know the 5 people in the area that might be involved in that. Sensible things like that. That should come back. That's something that's very important and used to be a productive part of policing. But instead, what you have is, as you say, to keep using that example, but it's the one that happens so often. Police officers, dancing at Pride or, pronouncing their pronouns on social media, all that kind of thing, which is, it's actually a pretense, because at the end of the day, you have the government at the moment passing legislation that allows police to crack down on protest. You've got police, for example, arresting people who post limericks about gender ideology online. The police are not your best friend.
Do you know what it's doing as well, Ella? It's trying to say we care, we really care. Well, if you care so much, why is a police station closing every 2 weeks? Why are fewer and fewer police... I'm a fan of the cops. They do a really tough job. But fewer and fewer police officers are living in the communities that they police. That's caring. Putting it on the line, that's caring.
Yes, and I think there is a sense of, I even though I'm full of criticism for the police, I appreciate that on an individual basis. As the last speaker said, there is people aren't cynical about these things. If you're going to sign up to a career of being spat at and chased and have physical violence and all that kind of things, a member of my family is a member of the Metropolitan Police. You want to do it for good. You're not in it. You're not in it for the late nights and the cleaning up the drunk sick in the police in the kind of police station. But there is a more broader sense of kind of the political understanding of the role that the police play, which is that they have to be involved, almost like sort of tentacles in reaching into all parts of our lives, rather than being very limited and saying, when my house gets burgled, when I have been raped, rape stats are terrible, or when there is something violent happening, that's when you could get involved. When someone says something mean to me online, it's none of your business. And I think we need to redraw those parameters of where the police are involved in public life.
Amen to all that. Ella, thanks very much indeed. Your thoughts on policing, you're emailing in numbers. Alex says the police have stood back from dealing with shoplifting and it's become a crime that is mostly dealt with by the shop owner. Nowadays, they care more about offences on Twitter and social media. Margaret says this is not a complicated issue. The police should not be taking the knee or dancing with the public. It is unseemly and completely inappropriate. The police should remain outside of all of that and be professional. David says, I'm not sure I understand the idea of the police reflecting the society from which they come. I see their job as solely keeping law and order. The Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, set to give approval to a nuclear power station costing up to £30 billion, in spite of the fact that he'll be leaving office next week. He's set to announce an in-principle agreement to offer funding to Sizewell C, the complex there in Suffolk. Despite concerns he'll be creating a multi-billion-pound spending commitment for the next PM, should that be Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak. Wade Allison is a professor of physics specialising in nuclear energy at the University of Oxford. Professor, welcome to you. I'm guessing the news from Suffolk, from Sizewell, is a cause of rejoicing for you.
I think it's It's a good thing. I don't think that people are divided on the subject now. I think Mr. Putin has explained why we've got to take...
Professor, hold that thought. I do apologise for being quite so rude, having just invited you on. We have to throw you off. We're going to Barrow-in-Furness there. The Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, is talking about global security threats with Australia's Deputy Prime Minister.
Of HMS Hampshire. And I think what's really amazing for me, I'm a North West MP and I don't live very far away, but to see the incredible complexity that the people of Barrow-in-Furness deliver in making some of the most advanced engineering projects on Earth and delivering it to the Royal Navy ready for operations is a real milestone and a real achievement for this part of the world and a centre of global excellence. So I was delighted that we could show our Australian friends what's on offer, what we do, how we manage to make these complex pieces of machinery, and then we had a number of chats around AUKUS, obviously the two pillars for AUKUS, but the main one being obviously the submarine issues and the next generation submarines, and then wider issues around the Indo-Pacific as well, and British-Australian work. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, can I, first of all, thank Secretary of State for Defence Ben Wallace for hosting me over the course of the last 2 days. It's been we've been really generously received. Had a fantastic dinner, I think, at your favourite pub last night, which was great. And it's been an honour to be here today, as well as obviously meeting with the Prime Minister Boris Johnson and to see the commissioning of HMS Anson. Over the past 2 days, we've been able to see BAE's operations in Govan, where the Type 26 is being built, the reference ship for the Hunter class, which Australia is building. And it was great to actually see the ship and to see that the program here is getting back on track, just as we are seeing the program in Australia get back on track. And then, of course, today, to see the enormity of what it is to have a capability of building a nuclear-powered submarine. It is a huge decision for our nation to walk down that path. It's one we are not taking lightly, but we are really determined to do. We've had a really productive conversation today about AUKUS and taking that forward. The decision about which submarine we go with and how quickly we can get that, the cost, and how we can make sure we're doing this in a way which does not give rise to proliferation. All of that work is happening at a pace. We look forward to be able to make the final announcements on time in the first part of next year. What's really clear is that it is not just about the hardware. It's not just about the submarine, as important as that is, but there's also a question about building the human capability, something that is really clear at this facility when you look at the training which is done here by BAE in terms of their construction staff, but also, of course, building a submariner fleet, which is why we're very keen to work with the United Kingdom around how we can build that submariner crew to future crew the nuclear-powered submarines in Australia. We're really pleased with the ability to do that through HMS Anson and the Astute fleet, I should say, and we are looking forward to replicating that in terms of having Australians participate here in respect of learning the skills to build submarines, just as we are seeing Australians on the job in Govan building the Type 26 frigate. I think it's fair to say that for Australia this is our oldest relationship. But through AUKUS, through these really critical defence procurements, what we are seeing is a new life being breathed into our oldest relationship. And there's never been a point where we have been more engaged, where we have been closer with the United Kingdom than we are right now. And we look forward with an enormous amount of optimism to the very rich agenda that our two nations have going forward.
Thank you both. So we've got some time for questions now. If you could just put your hand up and identify your outlet and who your question is addressed to, please.
Minister, do you think any of the Australian submariners who do this training on the Astute class will ever actually serve on an Australian-operated nuclear sub? And does that mean perhaps that Britain will be stepping in to provide some sort of capability in the near term?
Well, the answer is yes. Well, I do see that. We need to develop the capability of having the physical hardware of having a nuclear-powered submarine as the next generation from the Collins-class submarines that we have right now, but we need to build the crew of submariners, and that's exactly the point. And I guess inherent in your question is a sense of timing. We need to be doing this as soon as we can. We have seen a wasted decade in terms of the decisions that Australia has needed to make in relation to the next generation of submarines after Collins. So we have no time to waste. And that's why in thinking through the decision that we need to make about which submarine we run with and how we can get that hardware in place as soon as possible, we also need to be thinking through how we get the human equation right as well. And that's why this is such an important part of that.
Secretary of State Latika Berg from the Sydney Morning Herald. Is Britain in a position to supply Australia with an Astute-class submarine? How soon could that be, and what would it cost?
Well, it's not in a position to provide an Astute in the here and now. That is, just out there is boat 5 are being commissioned with 6 and 7 still in the assembly hall. But I think what is absolutely the case is that I need the 7. Once I've got the 7, the ability to pulse, base, potentially, and be more permanent over the Pacific becomes a very much a greater reality. And I think, the Collins class comes out in the mid-2030s. I think that answers both the former point is, a Navy career is longer than that. So the people training now will be the software, the experience of co-locating or pulsing patrols out in Australia. We've already had an Astute visit Perth last year. I think that will continue. But also I think what's really key here is that we're in the same cycle for the next generation. So the Astutes that were launched, some of them are 10 years old, if not longer soon. We have the same time, mid-2030s, that's where we have to start delivering the next generation of attack submarines. It's the same for the Australians. So hopefully we're getting in a place of convergence. So at the time we get to it, hopefully a truly UK, US, Australian enterprise, we get to position mid-2030s where we have people with the knowledge. Places like this, there's going to be 1,000 people, young people from Cumbria going through this from September, building on the hundreds already from last year, producing a skills base. And I think we'll be in the right place to be actually all in sync at the same time.
Don, thank you. Ministers, Dominic Nicholson, The Telegraph. Minister, in terms of support for Ukraine, how many more bush monsters are you going to send and when? And do you think it's time for Australia to send trainers to the UK as part of the international programme of training Ukrainian soldiers like New Zealand has done? And for Minister Wallace, in terms of red lines on foreign ownership of critical national infrastructure, do you think it's wise that Landbridge have got a 97-year lease or 92 years left on the lease at Darwin? Thank you.
On Darwin? Well, look, I think, first of all, it's a matter for the Australian state what it decides on who leases what. I think, first and foremost, both of us have powers that enable us to make decisions about protecting our infrastructure. We've obviously took only last year through, I think, the new legislation that allows us here in the UK. On the trainers, we'd be delighted to be joined. I think the Australians have already been engaged with us on a number of occasions with the expertise. The New Zealanders came over to the specific 105mm artillery training, and when that's complete, there'll obviously be lots of other opportunities. We're doing quite a lot together, and we've structured the international training for the Ukrainians to allow as many people as possible. The Lithuanians have agreed last week. I think that puts the Canadians, Lithuanians, Norwegians, Swedish, Danish, British, and the Dutch out there doing it right now, and we'll be delighted if Australia wishes to join us. It's the same type of armies with the same non-commissioned officer cadre that's so important that we need to help the Ukrainians with, that I think could really make a difference.
Yeah. Obviously, we are very committed to Ukraine. We're the largest non-NATO contributor to the support of Ukraine. And whilst Ukraine's a long way from Australia, we're doing that because we see that the issues at stake, the principles at stake in Ukraine are resonate all around the world and are very relevant to Australia's national interest. 60 Bushmasters is the answer to your question, and we're in the process of getting them to Ukraine. We're actively considering the question of training, and we really do see that is an important question that needs to be, or capability that needs to be worked through. So we're looking at this in a very active way, and we hope to be able to talk more about that in the future.
So just first, if you'd like to go first, you've done it.
Jacqueline Magnay from the Australian. Deputy Prime Minister, you mentioned a workforce perhaps agreement here as well. Can you elaborate on what that would involve? And in terms of the submariners, can you give an indication of how many Australian military personnel or the submariners will be working with the Royal Navy?
Yeah. Probably the answer to that question is no, in the sense that we're working through all of those details. But what's important is that we are growing a crew of submariners for the future. So, we need to be doing this with a significant number. And I know that's not specific, but that's the sort of problem that we're trying to address, to resolve, and that's the conversation that we're having. But this is a really important statement of principle that we can walk down that path. In terms of those shipbuilders, again, we've had something like 80 people go through, shipbuilders go through a program at Govan in terms of the Type 26. That's really important in building a critical mass of people who will be able to go back to Adelaide and use their skills in building the Hunter class. We need to be doing a version of that in respect of submarines as well. And it needs to end up being a significant number. At the end of the day, the great benefit of AUKUS, the great benefit of our relationship with the United Kingdom, is that we are able to have not just a transfer of technology in respect of the hardware, but a transfer of skills in respect of the people, and we're really focused on making sure that dimension works as well.
A lot more cooperation between Britain and Australia when it comes to matters of defence. There's the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace and the Australian Deputy Prime Minister talking about defence cooperation. AUKUS, the big Anglo-Australian-American Defence Pact, seen as a buffer against Chinese expansionism in the Pacific. That's part of what they're talking about there. We thought we'd give you a flavour. We'll be writing that online as well if you want to read a bit more about that. We're going to take a break. Afterwards, we'll be reflecting on 25 years since the death of Diana, Princess of Wales.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club. Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. Over a drink, we have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Well, it's been 25 years since Britain woke up to the news. The news from Paris that Diana, Princess of Wales, had died following a car crash. Her death sparked an outpouring of grief from around the world. The Prime Minister at the time, Tony Blair, famously called her the People's Princess in a TV address that he gave from his Sedgefield constituency, adding that he and the rest of the country were distraught. Well, ahead of this anniversary, Prince Harry, who was 12 when his mother died, said he wants the day to be filled with memories of Diana's work and a love for the way she went around about that charitable work. The royal commentator, writer and biographer Angela Levin is with us here in the studio today. Angela, it's just, I think, 25 years. We're beyond that point now where you have to tread quite so carefully about what you say. I think there was a time in the months and even years after Diana's death where it was quite difficult to strike a critical note. And I think, I know Ella's probably got strong views on what that said about our ability to process controversial ideas. We'll get into that maybe, but just in terms of how you've felt about the news when it came through.
I was crying within minutes, and I couldn't believe it, really. I was equally shocked that she hadn't worn a seatbelt. I couldn't understand how anybody could go in a car like that. I also couldn't understand how they persuaded the driver, who was 3 times over the the level of alcohol, to let them drive, and that she turned down Prince Charles's offer of paying for all her support and all the people guarding her. And I just thought it was the most terrible tragedy, but also a lesson to ourselves that actually you can't make these very quick decisions, especially if you're so famous, without actually making sure that everything is okay. And I think that's a terrible thing to have lingering so many years later, if only. A lot of people say if only, but actually this, apparently, if she'd had a seatbelt on, she had 80% chance of
I interviewed
survival.
the other guy, the survivor, Trevor Rees-Jones, the bodyguard. He survived because he had his seatbelt on.
Yes.
The Henry Paul was off his head on drink and drugs. There are still people who are reluctant to accept a mundane reason for the loss of Diana, Princess of Wales. It's almost as if they can't accept that drink driving, which still takes off, dozens of people every year, could take off somebody quite so extraordinary, but it did. And yet people persist in peddling conspiracy theories about MI5 and Prince Philip and all the rest of it. Can you understand why that happens?
They still are. I think people don't want to face the reality of what happened and how it happened. And so somebody makes up something and then everybody piles onto that. And it's absolutely absurd because there were tremendous amount of investigation seeing what happened. The same way that they said she was pregnant, but there was absolutely no sign of that. Doctor after doctor has said there was absolutely no sign. But I think if people don't want to believe it, they don't believe it. And actually, we need all to grow up and be sensible that sometimes things happen, they're absolute calamity and utterly horrible, but they are real and you have to accept them. And I think that's quite important for us to do.
Did you feel that it was a case of newspapers doing their job in acting as tribunes of the people, or did they go over the top in the context of, we just had Neil Wallace, who at the time was the deputy editor of The Sun in 1997, and he was clearly of the mind that the newspapers all agreed that the royals had to, the Queen had to come down from Balmoral. But I just wonder whether you think that was a mistake.
Well, I worked just opposite Kensington Palace, and I and a couple of colleagues went over every single morning for that first week, and we saw the flowers coming up and we saw the mood change of the people. First they were silent, they couldn't speak, they were so upset. Then there were tears and crying, and then there was aggression and angry, and they were really saying, where is the Queen? Where is her? Where is she? She must come down.
Well,
so I think...
remember the newspaper headlines asking, I mean, I don't know to what extent the newspapers reflected public anger or
Yes.
to what degree they stoked it. I do remember the Daily Express, what was it, show some, where are you, Mum, or what, you know, there was...
But that was there for us to see. It wasn't actually something that came from the papers. We went back and spoke to the editor and said, this is what's happening, it's very dangerous. I think where the fault was that the Queen didn't have someone explain on her behalf that she had chosen to keep the two boys up there to soften the immediately terrible feeling that they'd lost their mother, and that it wasn't a good idea to bring them down very quickly. We didn't know that for several days, and I think it was blowing up, well, the Queen didn't like her, and why isn't she doing it? But I think there was a mistake from the aides of not actually putting out a statement very early. And the thing is that when the Queen did come down and speak on the eve of the funeral, she explained things and everything softened. Everyone realised that actually she was acting as a grandmother, not as a queen, and she wanted to protect her grandsons. And it made sense, but it wasn't done quick enough, I think.
Ella, for Angela and I, what happened on this date 25 years ago feels like a big punctuation mark in the story of the country. You were 6 when it happened. I mean, I'm guessing you do not register it in anything like the same way, because, you know, you're too young for it to mean anything in that sense. But does it strike you retrospectively as an important moment or something overblown by boomers?
No, I don't think it... I might agree with you in relation to the kind of hysteria point, the national hysteria. But I think that what you have to understand is, and actually David Starkey alluded to this, he used very strong language but in his interview, but
you don't say.
He alluded to this, which was that, you know, Diana herself was a very big fan of emoting. She really openly said, I want to be, you know, to show real life, I want to show my emotions. She was, you know, actively trying to be different from the studied kind of cold, you know...
stiff upper lip.
Yes, stiff upper lip, distance kind of nature in which the royals had previously presented themselves. But that changed the nature of the way, I think actually had ramifications for British politics, for the way in which the British public saw itself in terms of, not to be too overblown about it, but there was this sense that publicly emoting, crying, holding hands, all that kind of stuff, was a good thing. It was a virtue. It was something that British people were lacking. And yes, there's nothing wrong with being publicly emotional, but that then channeled into, I think, this way in which we now view the royals, which is that if they do things behind closed doors, or if they have that kind of sense of studied distance, that it's a terrible thing, and that we should all be like Diana. And in fact, actually, I think the outpouring was a sense of people saying we should all be like Diana and crying in public. And it's not just the kind of or sort of the prude in me that thinks, oh, that's terrible, but it's that sort of fetishizing of emotions has negative consequences.
When I interviewed Prince Harry for my biography of him, he told me that the worst thing, he said this thing that you should never allow a child to walk behind their parent on a hearse, but the worst thing was that everybody behaved as if she belonged to them. And they'd never seen her, they'd never met her, and he felt really angry that they were taking that away from him and William, which is a very interesting thing for a young man to feel. And how dare they? And when they tried to grab him, and he said they had their hands wet with tears and they held mine. It was awful. It was just awful. She was my mother. And I think that that was the start of everybody feeling that they're involved in all these catastrophes and they need to be looked after emotionally because of it. But of course not. I mean, it is somebody else. If you don't know them, then you can be sad. You can think it's awful. but you mustn't weep and cry and take it off from the person who's actually directly affected from it.
Angela Levin, it's always lovely to see you here in the studio. Thanks so much for coming in. Thanks very much indeed. We'll try and get our debate away before the end of the hour. The East Midlands is the most recent area to be considered for new powers in a devolution deal. It would be granted if the government's levelling up bill gets through. The deal would create a mayoral combined county authority in Derby, Derbyshire, Nottingham and Nottinghamshire, and see the election of a mayor come 2024. The government's levelling up bill has been criticised by MPs to say that it lacks detail and doesn't show that levelling up is anything more than a slogan. Our question, does devolution at this level work? We're joined by David Hurdson, who's Deputy Chair of the Yorkshire Party, and Dr David Martin-Jones, who's a visiting professor at King's College, London. Gentlemen, welcome to you both. David Hurdson, to you first. Devolution at this level, can it work?
It can work, but it could work a lot better if substantially greater powers were devolved to regions, and that's what the Yorkshire Party is pushing for. We have mayors in West Yorkshire and South Yorkshire at the moment. They have relatively limited budgets, they have relatively limited powers. Compare that with what Wales has, what Scotland has. They have vastly more control over their own affairs and much more scope to improve the lives of the people that live there.
Dr Martin-Jones, same question to you really. Devolution at this level, they used to talk in Brussels a lot about subsidiarity, governance at the lowest possible level. It's good for democracy, they said.
Yeah, well, that was the idea, when the devolution agenda got going with Tony Blair in 1997, and the impact on somewhere like Wales, which I know very well, has not had the democratic consequences that David just said it would have for Yorkshire. In fact, by all indicators, in terms of employment, in terms of GDP growth, in terms of attracting investment, in terms of the health and welfare of the people, devolution has not worked. It's been pretty much a disaster, I'd say.
David Hurdson, what do you say, David Hurdson, to those people who argue it introduces an extra layer of bureaucracy that costs the taxpayer dear?
I think you have to invest in democracy. I don't think that devolution has to cost more. Certainly these proposals for Derby and Nottinghamshire do add an extra layer, and I'm somewhat sceptical that taking power upwards from councils rather than downwards from Westminster is the right model. But if you have a regional authority or a national authority in Wales and Scotland, they can advocate, they can be an advocate for their areas and draw in money both internally and externally. Scotland's seen more foreign direct investment than any other region within the United Kingdom, bar London. I don't think that's a coincidence. So they have a powerful government that can act as a strong unified voice for them. But I agree with David that devolution doesn't necessarily work if you don't have the right people and the right policies in place. It's a tool, it's not a magic wand.
Well, just briefly, Dr Martin-Jones, on Scotland, I mean, there's an argument that runs, I mean, there we had the positive spin. There's another argument that says actually devolution was meant to be a break on the partition of the United Kingdom, if I can put it quite so in such an inflammatory way, and it's ended up being an accelerator.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the modernisation agenda of Tony Blair in 1997 was that these referenda would put an end to the idea of separatism. And in fact, it's the reverse. Scotland's the most dramatic example of, devolution facilitating the vanishing of the United Kingdom, which is, has gone along by leaps and bounds since the lockdown.
Gentlemen, we've got to leave it there. David Hurdson and Dr David Martin-Jones, thanks for your time both very much indeed. Michelle Dewberry here to tell you what's coming up next on Jubes & Co. Michelle.
Hello, Colin. Yes. I'll start by asking, is the world better off thanks to Mikhail Gorbachev? Fascinated to hear what my viewers think about that. And, of course, the anniversary of Princess Diana's death. Was that, some say, the demise of the monarchy? Are they right or not? And someone who, quite frankly, I can't stand talking about, Colin, but sometimes I have to. Shamima Begum, apparently, she was trafficked into Syria by a Canadian spy. So tonight I'm asking, are there any circumstances at all? And is this it, where she should be allowed back in Britain? Peter Hitchens, columnist and journalist, joining me, as is the filmmaker Kerry Dingle.
OK, Michelle, thanks very much indeed. Our thanks to Ella Whelan, who has been our studio guest tonight. The story that matters, that will stand the test of time today. Well, actually, you haven't got time. Have a look if the viewer's interested in your monologue on strikes. Really interesting. Disagree with every word, but very compelling nonetheless. Michelle's next.
I'm Alex Deakin with your latest weather update from the Met Office. Another dry and bright day for most tomorrow with sunny spells and probably feeling, certainly by the afternoon, a little bit warmer than it does out there today. High pressure is controlling our weather currently. There are low pressure systems lurking. We are going to see a change by the weekend. But for most of us, as I said, that high pressure will continue to dominate. It's bringing a breeze in from the North Sea. It's a bit chilly on some of these North Sea coasts, and also just one or two showers drifting in on that breeze across parts of eastern England. But they're few and far between. Most places dry, staying with clear spells overnight as well. It will be a cool night once more, certainly across Scotland. Temperatures in rural areas well down into single figures. A little warmer than last night in the south. Some towns and cities staying in the teens. On to Thursday, and again, a dry and a bright day for most. A bit more cloud over northeast England especially. One or two showers are possible close by to Newcastle and Durham, but say most will stay dry. Late in the day, just the threat of some showers coming up across southernmost parts of England too. The sunshine will turn quite hazy here, but it will be a warm day, 24, 25, and a touch warmer with the sunny spells across Scotland and Northern Ireland too. More of a change as we go through tomorrow evening. More showers drifting up from France and over the Channel to southern parts of England, across the Midlands and into parts of Wales, and they'll continue to drift in during Friday. Somewhat hit and miss, so if you're after rain, this is no guarantee at this stage that you will see some, but increasing chance of seeing showers on Friday here, but also for Northern Ireland and Western Scotland, we'll start to see a weather front moving in, bringing more cloud and some showers possibly too. Temperature-wise, well, again, high teens mostly across the far north. We're looking at 21 to 20.